Okay, so pet cloning. It's everywhere you look these days, and we've got a ton of listener questions and interesting sources about it.
It seems like it's one of those things that was sci-fi just a few years ago, and now
It's real.
it's here.
Oh.
People are actually doing it. We're talking creating a genetically identical copy of a pet.
Mostly dogs and cats, right?
Yeah, mostly dogs and cats, but the price tag is pretty hefty. I mean,
Yeah.
you're looking at around $50,000 for a dog
Oof.
and $25,000 for a cat.
Still a lot of meows.
Hmm.
But before we get too far, I think it's important to address that like common misconception.
Yeah.
You know that cloning your pet will bring back like the exact same personality and everything.
Right. It's not exactly a copy-paste situation. You're getting a genetically identical pet, yes. But, it's not going to have all the same quirks and personality traits as the original.
So it's not like you can hit rewind on your pet's life and start over.
Exactly. I like to think of it like identical twins that are born years apart. They have the same DNA, the same blueprint, but they're going to grow up to be different people because of their experiences, their environment, all of that.
Okay, so it's not a guaranteed way to bring back like your beloved Sparky exactly as you remember him.
Exactly. There are so many factors that go into shaping a pet's development. Their diet, their training, their social interactions, even just like the random stuff that happens in their lives.
Yeah, all that stuff contributes to who they become.
Right. And there's actually a whole field of study called epigenetics that explores how environmental factors can actually change how genes are expressed.
Hold on, epigenetics, that sounds like something out of a textbook.
It's not as complicated as it sounds.
Uh-huh.
Basically, epigenetics looks at how genes can be like switched on or off based on what's happening in the environment.
So like a light switch that's controlled by the world around them?
That's a good way to put it. So even though a clone has the same DNA, the same cookbook as the original pet, their environment is kind of like the chef deciding which recipes to use.
Okay, that makes it much easier to understand.
And this explains why clones can end up being different from the original pet, even though they have identical DNA. Like they might have different markings, different personalities, even different health outcomes.
So like even if someone is really set on like cloning their pet to get that exact replica?
Well, they might be in for a surprise.
Exactly, yeah. So you really have to go into it with realistic expectations. It's not a carbon copy situation.
Right, you're getting a genetically similar individual, but it's going to have its own unique journey and develop its own unique personality.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
So let's say someone understands all of that and they still decide to go ahead with pet cloning.
Right.
What are like some of the potential benefits beyond just, trying to replicate a beloved pet?
Well, one really interesting thing is that all this research that's gone into pet cloning, it's actually contributing to a better understanding of genetic diseases,
Hmm.
not just in animals, but potentially in humans too.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Really? So how does that work?
So imagine like a disease like canine hip dysplasia. It's pretty common in dogs. Researchers could use cloning to create a bunch of genetically identical dogs that are predisposed to that condition.
Okay, and then what?
Well, then they can study these clones in controlled environments and really try to tease apart which genes and environmental factors are contributing to the disease developing.
That's really fascinating. So by studying clones, we can get a much clearer picture of how these diseases work, right?
Exactly. And the cool thing is this applies to all sorts of conditions, cancer, autoimmune disorders, you name it.
So the implications for like human health could be huge.
Absolutely. And it doesn't stop there. The tech behind pet cloning could also be used for conservation efforts for endangered species.
Wait, so you're telling me we could be bringing back like extinct animals, like Jurassic Park style?
Well, not quite Jurassic Park. De-extinction is still pretty much in the realm of science fiction, at least for now.
Yeah.
But cloning could be a really valuable tool for preserving the genetic diversity of endangered species.
So like creating like a genetic backup for species that are on the brink?
Yeah, exactly. Or even reintroducing lost genes back into dwindling populations. It's all about protecting those species and making sure they have a chance to survive.
Wow. Okay, so pet cloning isn't just about recreating furry companions. It's about understanding genetics, potentially revolutionizing medicine, and maybe even saving species from extinction.
Yeah, it's a technology with a lot of potential. And I think it's important to keep that bigger picture in mind as we explore its implications.
That's a great point. So we've talked about the science and some potential applications, but what about something like cloning working animals, like service dogs or search and rescue dogs?
Yeah, that's an area that's getting a lot of attention, especially with, the potential to preserve the genetic lines of those really exceptional working animals.
So, like, imagine being able to clone a dog with an incredible sense of smell or one that's, just amazing at search and rescue.
Exactly. Theoretically, we could use cloning to pass down those desirable traits.
So we could have, like, a whole team of super sniffers or highly skilled guide dogs. Is that what you're saying?
Well, not necessarily.
Hmm.
You see, even though a clone might inherit the potential for those traits, training still plays a huge role.
Oh, right, of course. It's not all in the genes.
Exactly. It's a combination of nature and nurture. And that actually brings us to a really interesting aspect, the future of pet cloning.
Okay, yeah. Like, what's next for this whole field? What might we see in the next, say, 10 years?
Well, I think one of the biggest changes we'll see is a pretty significant drop in cost. As the technology gets more advanced and streamlined, it'll likely become much more affordable.
So maybe one day it won't cost an arm and a leg to clone your pet?
Exactly. And another thing that's really interesting is the potential for combining cloning with genetic modification.
Wait, hold on. Are we talking about, like, designer pets?
Well, that's one way to think about it. Imagine being able to not only clone your pet, but also edit its genes to eliminate certain diseases, or maybe even enhance certain traits.
Whoa, that sounds pretty sci-fi.
It does, doesn't it? But it also raises a lot of ethical questions. Where do we draw the line? Is it okay to design pets based on our own preferences? It's a conversation we definitely need to have.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope for sure. It kind of brings up that whole, like, playing God argument that people often have with new technologies.
Yeah, that comes up a lot. But, humans have been selectively breeding animals for centuries, shaping their traits to suit our needs.
Right, so in a way, we've been manipulating animal genes for a long time.
Exactly. And cloning is, in a sense, just a more direct way of doing that.
Hmm.
But the key is to use this technology responsibly and with careful consideration for the welfare of the animals.
Yeah, it's definitely not about replacing lost pets. It's more about exploring the potential of this technology and understanding its limitations.
Absolutely. And with that responsible use comes the need for regulations and ethical guidelines. We need to make sure that animal welfare is prioritized and that this technology isn't misused or exploited.
Makes sense. So, if someone is thinking about cloning their pet, what advice would you give them?
Well, first and foremost, do your research. Don't jump into this blindly. Understand the process, the costs, the potential benefits and limitations, and all those ethical considerations we've been talking about. And it's also really important to manage your expectations.
Yeah, you're not getting your old pet back.
Exactly. You're welcoming a new individual into your life, one that shares some genetic similarities, but will have its own unique personality and journey.
So it's more like welcoming a distant relative that happens to look a lot like your beloved pet.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's about appreciating the individuality of each animal, even if they share a genetic link.
And what about the ethical side of things? What should people be thinking about before making this decision?
I think it's important to think about where your resources are going. Could those resources be used to help a larger number of animals in other ways? Like supporting animal shelters or rescue organizations. Those are powerful alternatives that can make a real difference.
So it's all about weighing your options and making an informed decision.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that our choices have broader implications, not just for our own lives, but for the lives of animals and the future of our planet.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from the science to the ethics, and even touched on the future of this whole field. But before we wrap up, I have one last question for you.
Go ahead.
Could this technology be used to bring back extinct species? Like, if we have the DNA, could we bring back, say, a woolly mammoth or a dodo bird?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? De-extinction is definitely something that has captured the imagination of a lot of people, but it's also a very controversial topic.
Yeah, I can see why. It brings up all sorts of questions about the ethics of manipulating life and death and the potential impact on ecosystems.
Exactly. And while the technology isn't quite there yet, it's something that scientists are actively exploring.
Wow.
But it's definitely a conversation we need to have as a society. We need to think about the ethical, ecological, even philosophical implications of something like that.
That's a really thought-provoking way to end this part of our deep dive. We've gone from the basics of pet cloning to the potential revival of extinct species, and it's clear that this technology raises a lot of big questions about our relationship with the natural world.
It does, doesn't it?
Hmm.
And it forces us to really think about the choices we make and the kind of future we want to create.
I agree, but we're not done yet. Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive into pet cloning, where we'll delve even deeper into the real-world landscape of this fascinating field. We'll be back right after.
Actually, I was thinking for part two, instead of getting too bogged down in all the technical details,
Yeah.
why don't we take a closer look at the pet cloning industry itself? The companies that are offering these services, the regulations surrounding them, all that.
Oh, I like that. It's important to understand the whole context, right? Not just the science.
Right. So in part two, we'll explore who's doing this, how they're doing it, and what kind of impact it's all having. It'll be a fascinating discussion, I promise.
Sounds great. Can't wait. See you then.
Exactly. But it's one thing to talk about it in theory, and another to see companies actually offering these services.
Right. And there are actually quite a few companies out there now that specialize in pet cloning. Mostly dogs and cats, of course.
I bet that's a booming industry, considering how much people love their pets.
Yeah, it's definitely gaining traction.
Yeah.
And as you could imagine with any new technology, especially one that deals with something as emotionally charged as bringing back a pet,
Yeah, it can get a little
complicated.
exactly. So, what about regulations? Are there any laws in place to make sure everything is ethical and above board? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. The regulations are still catching up to the science, and they vary a lot from country to country.
So it's a bit of a Wild West situation in some places.
Yeah, kinda. And that's why it's so important to have clear guidelines and oversight, to protect both the animals and the people involved.
Right. So what are some of the things that those regulations should be focusing on?
Well, first and foremost, the welfare of the animals has to be the top priority. That means the surrogate mothers, the clones themselves, and even the donor animals.
So making sure that everyone is treated humanely throughout the whole process.
Exactly. And there's also the issue of transparency. Companies need to be upfront about the success rates, the potential risks, the costs involved.
And, not misleading people into thinking they're getting an exact replica of their pet.
Right. Managing expectations is key. And then there's the question of genetic diversity.
Oh, yeah, that's something we talked about last time. Like, if too many people start cloning their pets, could that lead to problems down the line?
Yeah, potentially. It could narrow the gene pool, which could make certain breeds more susceptible to diseases.
So maybe regulations need to address that too, like making sure there's some balance.
Yeah, it's all about finding that balance. And then there's also the question of access and equity.
What do you mean by that?
Well, right now, pet cloning is pretty expensive, right? As the cost comes down, will it become something that only wealthy people can afford, or will it be accessible to everyone?
That's a really interesting social question.
Yeah, it is. And it's something that we need to think about as this technology becomes more widespread.
Makes sense. So we've talked about regulations. What about the companies themselves? Are there any big players in the pet cloning world?
Oh, yeah, definitely. One of the most well-known is VGen Pets. They're based in the United States, and they've been cloning pets for several years now.
They seem to be doing a lot of business.
Yeah, they've cloned hundreds of pets, mostly dogs and cats. And they're not just focused on the cloning itself, they're also doing a lot of research to advance the science.
So they're kind of like the pioneers in this field.
In a lot of ways, yeah. But there are other companies too. Zoom Biotech in South Korea is another big one.
What do they specialize in?
They're known for their work in dog cloning. And they've even done some high-profile projects, like cloning working dogs for law enforcement.
Oh, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it is. And then you have companies like Sinogene in China, which are growing really fast and attracting clients from all over the world.
So it's becoming a global industry.
Exactly. Which brings up another layer of complexity, because now you have to think about international regulations and how to make sure everyone is playing by the same rules.
Right, because ethics and animal welfare shouldn't stop at borders.
Exactly. It's a global issue. So to answer your question about big players, yes, there are definitely some companies that are leading the charge, but the landscape is constantly changing as new companies emerge and the technology evolves.
Wow, it sounds like it's a really dynamic industry. What are some of the trends you're seeing?
Well, one interesting trend is the growing demand for personalized pet cloning experiences.
What do you mean by personalized?
Well, companies are now offering things like preserving pet cells for future cloning.
So, like if you're not ready to clone your pet now, you can save their DNA for later.
Exactly. Or creating genetic twin embryos that can be implanted at a later date. And some companies are even incorporating pet DNA into jewelry and other keepsake items.
Wow, that's taking it to a whole new level.
Yeah, it really shows how emotionally invested people are in this. They're looking for ways to connect with their pets even after they're gone.
It's about keeping that bond alive.
Exactly. And another trend is the growing interest in combining cloning with genetic modification.
So we're talking about designer pets again.
Yeah, it's becoming more and more of a possibility as gene editing techniques become more advanced. We might see people wanting to clone their pet and also eliminate certain genetic diseases or maybe even enhance certain traits.
It's almost like we're stepping into the world of science fiction, but it's happening right now.
It is. And it's why we need to have these conversations about the ethical implications. What are the limits of this technology? How do we ensure that it's used responsibly?
It's a lot to think about, but I think it's amazing that we're even having these discussions.
Yeah, it's important to stay informed and to engage in these conversations so that we can make the best decisions for the future of this technology and for the welfare of all animals.
Well said. So we've gone from the science of pet cloning to the companies and the trends shaping the industry. It's clear that this field is rapidly evolving.
It is, and it's raising a lot of important questions along the way.
And I think it's time we tackle the biggest one, the ethical considerations surrounding all of this.
That's a conversation we can't avoid. So in our final segment, we'll delve into the ethical complexities, explore different perspectives, and really try to grapple with the moral dilemmas that pet cloning presents. Stay with us.
And we're back. So we've talked about the science, the companies, the trends, all of that. But now it's time to really dive into the heart of the matter.
Yeah, the ethics of pet cloning. It's something that comes up every time we talk about this technology.
It's a big one. And, looking at the sources that you sent, it's clear that there are a lot of different viewpoints on this.
There are. I think a good place to start is to just think about all the different people and animals involved. You've got the pet owners who are obviously motivated by a lot of love and grief. And then you have the animals themselves, the surrogates, the donors,
Yeah.
and the clones.
Right. And then there's the whole, societal impact to consider.
Exactly. So it's not just a personal decision. It's something that raises a lot of broader ethical questions.
Yeah, is it really okay to clone a pet when there's so many animals in shelters that need homes?
That's a big one. And, is the desire to, like, replicate a beloved companion, does that outweigh the potential risks and unknowns of cloning?
I mean, it's easy to see how someone could get caught up in those emotions, especially if they've recently lost a pet.
Absolutely. Grief can be a powerful motivator. But it's important to try to approach this with a balanced perspective.
Yeah, to weigh the potential benefits against those ethical concerns.
Right. And one of the biggest concerns is the whole issue of resource allocation. Cloning is expensive, and it requires a lot of scientific expertise. So some people argue that those resources could be better spent on, helping animals that are already alive.
Yeah, like funding animal shelters or research into animal diseases.
Exactly. And it's not just about money. Cloning also requires specialized facilities, skilled personnel, and often involves multiple attempts before a viable clone is produced. So there's that question of sustainability, too.
It's a lot to consider.
It is. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of animal welfare. Is cloning itself harmful to the animals involved?
Right, because it's not just about the clone itself. It's about all the animals that are part of that process.
Exactly. So, for example, obtaining eggs from donor animals often involves hormone treatments and surgery, which can be stressful for them. And then you have the surrogate mothers who undergo a lot of hormonal manipulation and may experience complications during pregnancy.
So there are risks for them, too.
There are. And then there's the health of the clones themselves. Cloned animals can be more prone to certain health issues like developmental problems, weakened immune systems, or even premature aging.
It sounds like there's still a lot we don't know about the long-term effects.
There is. And that's why some people argue that it's ethically problematic to subject animals to these potential risks, even if it's done with good intentions.
Yeah, I can see that. So we've talked about resource allocation, animal welfare, but what about, the emotional side of things? I mean, people who want to clone their pets are doing it out of love, right?
Of course. The bond between humans and animals is incredibly strong, and losing a pet can be just as painful as losing a human loved one. So for some people, the idea of cloning offers a sense of hope, a way to reconnect with that special bond.
I get it. But isn't there a danger of, like, creating false expectations? We've already talked about how a clone isn't an exact replica of the original pet.
Right? And that's something that pet cloning companies need to be very clear about. They need to make sure people understand that a clone isn't a resurrection of their lost pet. It's a genetically similar individual, but it will have its own unique personality, temperament, and even physical appearance.
So it's really important to manage those expectations.
It is. It's about seeing cloning as a way to, like, continue a legacy in a new way, not as a way to replace what's been lost.
Yeah, each animal is special in its own way, even if it shares some genes with another animal.
Exactly. And this actually brings up another ethical concern, which is the whole idea of commodification of animals. Does cloning turn pets into commodities?
Like objects that can just be replicated and replaced.
Right. Some people argue that cloning reinforces the idea that animals exist solely for human benefit, and that their worth is based on how well they can fulfill our needs.
I can see how that would be concerning.
Yeah. And then there's the whole playing God argument, which is something that comes up with a lot of new technologies. Like, do we have the right to manipulate life in this way?
It's a big question, and I don't think there's an easy answer.
There isn't. But it's a conversation we need to have, and we need to have it with a lot of humility. We need to recognize that there are always potential unintended consequences when we start tinkering with nature.
Like what?
Well, one concern is the impact on genetic diversity. If cloning becomes widespread, we could see a narrowing of the gene pool, which could make certain breeds more susceptible to diseases.
So it's about maintaining a balance, not just going all in on cloning.
Right. And then there are potential social consequences, too. Like, if pet cloning becomes more affordable, will it just widen the gap between the rich and the poor?
Yeah, those are all important things to think about.
They are. And, there's always the risk of misuse. What happens if this technology falls into the wrong hands? Could it be used to, like, create animals for fighting or exploit them in other ways?
Those are scary thoughts.
They are. And that's why regulation is so important. We need to have clear ethical guidelines and laws in place to prevent abuse.
Yeah, it's about protecting the animals and ensuring that this technology is used responsibly.
Exactly. Ultimately, the decision of whether or not to clone a pet is a very personal one. But it's a decision that should be made with a full understanding of the science, the ethics, and the emotional complexities.
Wow, you've given us a lot to think about.
I hope so. Pet cloning is a really fascinating topic, and it raises a lot of important questions about our relationship with animals and the choices we make.
Yeah, it really makes you think about what it means to be human in this age of rapidly advancing technology.
It does, doesn't it?
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into tech cloning. It's been an incredible conversation.
It has, and I hope our listeners have learned a lot and maybe even started thinking about some of these issues in new ways.
Yeah, it's all about staying informed and having those thoughtful conversations.
Exactly. And remembering that at the end of the day, it's all about respecting the animals and making sure their welfare comes first.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.